This is Liberty Law Talk, part of Liberty Fund's online library of law and liberty. Your host is Liberty Fund Fellow Richard Reinsch. Our web address is libertylawsite.org, where you can subscribe, comment, find other episodes and links related to today's conversation. Our email address is lal@libertyfund.org. Today we are discussing with Robin Harris his new biography, Not for Turning, The Life of Margaret Thatcher. Robin Harris was a speechwriter and policy advisor to Margaret Thatcher during her premiership and became one of her most closest political advisors. He also drafted the 2 volumes of her autobiography. Robin, glad to have you on the program.
Glad to be with you.
So as I'm reading your book, and I realize as I'm reading it that I've always had an admiration for Margaret Thatcher. I've watched various speeches that she gave on YouTube now. Not for Turning, of course, is a speech I've watched over and over again, even though it's a very short speech. But I guess I'm left wondering, and maybe this is how we can start the interview, who was Margaret Thatcher?
Oh, well.
Not that that's not a loaded question, but I thought maybe that would be a way to get into the discussion.
Well, it is. I mean, first of all, what she wasn't just the sort of statutory woman. She actually quite well recognized that in the political society, British political society, in the first few decades after the war, I mean, you were treated as being the statutory woman, and she was the statutory woman in Macmillan's cabinet. Well, not cabinet, in his government, and so on. But she wasn't just a sort of another woman, and she didn't just get on because she was a woman, and she wasn't held back, for that reason and so on. So we shouldn't just look at her as being the statutory political woman or the ideal political woman, or anything of that sort. She was a very rounded personality. She was authentic. And so many politicians today, of course, don't come across as authentic and probably aren't even authentic. I mean, she had a very strong character, which had developed over the years, partly, I think, as a result of her background, her religious background. Her father was a Wesleyan lay preacher. She came from a very stiff and stern Wesleyan background. And although she herself wasn't always stiff and stern, I mean, that certainly had an impact on her. And she had beliefs. She didn't just have opinions. And having beliefs is rather disorientating for many conservatives, or at least the old-fashioned conservatives, because they were really self-proclaimed pragmatists, and in many cases, certainly in Britain, undoubted cynics. And she had a sort of fire and zeal which came from her authenticity, from her beliefs, from her background. And all of this was actually magnified, I think, because she had an extremely strong and passionate and fiery personality. People, when they get into high office, and the very highest offices, they do gain a certain magnetism. They do somehow become a little bit larger than life. Partly it's just the effect of media attention, but it's just one of the things that happens to people, both for good and bad. But even after she left office, she really could fill a room. She was a small woman, but she was a life force. So I suppose, yes, I mean, she was an authentic, unique individual who left an enormous imprint on Britain. That's who she was.
Let me ask you, thinking about that you have this observation that more than any other prime minister the last few decades in Britain, she was made by her upbringing. And I suppose you've kind of alluded to that in your answer. Another question, though, that comes to mind: how does she come to a conservative philosophy? I mean, it's when I read your book and we read about her upbringing and her father, and so something of a successful small businessman, self-made, and really, I mean, I think he, as you point out, he builds 2 or 3 more businesses out of his initial success.
That's right.
And so I guess in one ways she breathes it in; it just becomes a part of her. But is there something else that leads to this sort of commitment to the market, to limited government, to rule of law, and actually thinking that the government actually should be a servant to all of these sorts of freedoms rather than intervening all the time?
Yes. The thing is that in Britain, at the time that she got involved in politics, the old Conservative Party, which was heavily aristocratic, and if they weren't aristocracy, they were nearly all, first of all, they're nearly all men, but they'd nearly all been to public schools, which, as you know, are your private schools. And they knew each other. They were members of the same clubs. They had a sort of de haut en bas view of society. It doesn't mean that they were bad people. They weren't, but they really didn't think that business mattered that much. They didn't understand it very much, and they sort of understood. I suppose I'm thinking about the Macmillan times now in the 50s. They sort of understood that people near the bottom of society wanted to get on, and they sort of understood that business was important and so on. And they also started to understand that people wanted to own their own homes, but they didn't feel any passion for this, and they didn't really understand it because they were people who inherited their wealth. They didn't make it in business. Actually, Macmillan himself was reasonably successful, but as a publisher, but again, it was an inherited business. And so the whole ethos of the Conservative Party, or at least the leadership of the Conservative Party, was not sympathetic to the sort of things that you've been talking about and the sort of things that she understood as a small businessman's daughter. But the combination, I would say, of free economics plus a very strong feeling that you've got to stand on your own feet and be personally independent and responsible in your life, that these sort of things which you and I can see are really the essence of conservatism in an Anglo-Saxon sense in your country and mine, that are fully grasped now. May not all be fully practiced now, but they're fully grasped now as the essence of conservatism. That sort of conservatism was not very important in the Conservative Party. It was the sort of conservatism that you found was useful at elections, and the sort of conservatism that motivated people like her father to go out and campaign for the party. But it's again important in Britain to recognize that economic liberalism, classical economic liberalism, again, was something which had really come into the Conservative Party with the move leftward of the Liberal Party in the first part of the 20th century. And as the Liberal Party, the Lloyd George Liberal Party, if you like, and his successors, but particularly Lloyd George, as the Liberal Party imbibed more collectivism and socialism, it put off the bedrock Protestant, dissenting Methodist and so on, supporters that it had in many cases, and particularly, of course, small business supporters who didn't want regulation, high taxation, and wanted to get on in the world and ensure that their children got on even further in the world. And those sort of people who had, as I said, particularly among dissenters, non-Church of England people, who've been very close to the Liberal Party, they moved away. And her father, there's no evidence that her father was actually a member of the Liberal Party and came over to the Conservatives. Certainly, I remember questioning her about this, and she said she'd always remembered him as a Conservative, but I think that probably in his early years he would not have been. And certainly people like him a few years earlier would not have been. But she absorbed these conservative values, which were far from being fully absorbed by the Conservative Party until she got them to be absorbed by the Conservative Party.
Thinking about, and this theme which fascinates me, and I want to get to Thatcherism and her time as Prime Minister and her time in the Heath government, which you described very well, and how what she learned from that and how that propels her into leadership. But this theme of her formation, I thought so interesting, and several points that stand out. One, I think, unavoidably after the end of World War II, is watching labor come to power and initiate a series of social democratic legislation, entitlements, interventions in the economy that I think are largely, beyond the pale of what we've experienced in America, and just how deep it went. Right. And I think it seems to me that left a mark on her, in particular watching Winston Churchill be turned out, whom you write about. She loved and admired greatly, particularly his speeches. And in fact, she gives a speech, which I want to just briefly mention, which in 1946. So she's already actively campaigning for the Conservative Party. She would have been, I guess, in her early 20s. She gives a speech, and it's in response to calls for the Conservative Party to be more open to the common man. Of course, she says we need to reach out more, all that sort of business. But in the direct quote, we cannot forget the need for the uncommon man. And I think that is so instructive, because that's a problem in any democracy, is that sort of mediocrity, egalitarian ethos flattens out everything, and you really can't even comprehend a leader like Churchill, except in an emergency situation, or even Thatcher. And I think that's why that quote just really stands out to me, because of the influence she comes to have.
Another one, or the thing that she picked it up actually from one of the Methodist preachers, but she adapted it to a political context that I'm sure he didn't intend to do. She always said that in the end we owe everything to the few, and she wasn't actually particularly thinking about economics there, but she was actually saying that a few individuals will always really make things happen.
Yeah,
and that insight is the opposite of what you might call populism, and therefore you often don't find it being articulated by conservatives, because if you do articulate, people say that you're a snob or an elitist or something, which obviously was actually not in any case true of her. I think she didn't come from that background. She wasn't an elitist in that sense, but she always thought that individuals mattered, and that the few individuals, you wouldn't know who they might be in any situation, were absolutely crucial to improving things. For example, winning a war.
Yeah. You have a term here early in describing her, I guess the coalescing perhaps of her policy, political vision, political thought, responsible individualism. And you juxtapose that with a quotation she made in an interview in 1987, which a lot of American conservatives have thought about. And the quotation was, she was asked about societal aspirations, et cetera, and she says, quote, "There's no such thing as society." And a lot of people have always taken that to mean, or say in America, well, she was actually much more classical liberal, if not libertarian, than, say, a counterpart, contemporary Ronald Reagan was, to make that sort of statement, because Hayek, Milton Friedman, and others made those sorts of comments. And so is there a sort of intellectual tracing or influence there on her own thought? And you say there's not, and it comes down to this responsible individualism. And I wanted just to get you to talk about that for a minute.
Yeah, she shouldn't have said what she did actually say in that interview. I mean, the thing is, what she said was brilliant. What she said was true. But there are some things that it's inexpedient to say in certain circumstances. But actually what she did say was absolutely right. And the context was that people were saying, well, she was being asked, there are people without jobs, there are people without housing, there are people who want better health care and this, that, and the other. What is society going to do about it? And it was in response to that. And when she said there's no such thing as society, what she meant, and indeed went on, and it's worth reading the full quote, what she actually meant was that in the end, society is you and me. And that when people say society should do something, in practice, they just actually mean the state should do something. And she then went on to say that people are talking about rights all the time, your right to a better health care, your right to a job, your right to education. She said, but all rights, all these entitlements, as she put it, people are talking about entitlements, but they all begin with duties. It's because somebody has to pay, or somebody actually has to act. And the duties come first, really. And just concentrating on the rights, you have a right to this, that, or the other, just puts more and more responsibility onto the state. And although she didn't develop the argument to quite this next stage, she would certainly have agreed with what I'm about to say, that when you do that, of course, you increase coercion in society, because the only way that the state can provide for all of these individual wants is by higher taxation and greater intervention in people's lives, so it reduces their freedom.
Yeah.
And that was the background to that remark.
Yeah, no, thank you for providing that. I think that's always been something that I've wondered about. With 1950 election you write about, and I think this is a part of the responsible individualism, and you say this is proto-Thatcherism. That's already evident in her platform, and so that seems to speak. How much did she really change her mind over the course of her career here? And we already see these sorts of ideas present. Of course, you write about a lot of ways that she develops this further, and her own mind is developed by certain intellectuals, certain classical liberal intellectuals in England, kind of challenging, I guess, stale, regnant ideas. But the proto-Thatcherism that we already see in the 1950 election, what was that?
Well, again, it's best to put this in context. That,
sure.
You, in fact, mentioned rightly the big program of socialism in the 1945 Attlee government, and the 1950 and indeed 51 general elections were fought against that and against that background, and Britain was obviously not becoming a communist country in the sense that we were not actually moving from allegiance to the United States to allegiance to the Soviet Union. We were not becoming a communist country in that sense, but in the sense of actually the takeover of the commanding heights of the economy and the handing over to state monopoly of the most important public services, we were actually so far on the road to socialism that we were becoming, in a certain sense, a communist country. And it was against that background that the 1950 and 51 elections were fought. So although what she said was very robust then in attacking, for example, nationalization and stressing the importance of people keeping their own money rather than having it taken away by confiscatory taxation and all this sort of thing. And also, remember, of course, the background, again, the international background, height of the Cold War, the Korean War, feeling of great danger overseas. And so, in a way, I think all conservatives were pretty conservative in their rhetoric at that time. But it's completely true that you'll find, I think, within her speeches, of the way she put things, you can see her conservative instincts on two matters. One, very strongly coming out that individuals have a right to keep the benefits that they themselves have earned through their own hard work. I mean, that we have a right not to be overtaxed. This is just. It isn't just that it is a good way of running the economy. It's actually morally right that should be so. And also a great worry about communism, and great belief also in it's the running down of the time of the British Empire, but she was a very strong imperialist too. She believed in the British colonial achievement, civilizing achievement, which she came to associate very closely with America's later achievement in creating a kind of Pax Americana. And so, yes, you can certainly see proto-Thatcherism there. But as I say, I just caution you against thinking that this was that unusual then, because I think it was a very sharply ideologically fought campaign.
Yeah. I want to ask you, and I think this really ties into this discussion we're having, and also something that you said earlier, and you talked about her role within the Conservative Party. And I guess as you're talking, I'm thinking the Conservative Party you're describing, that part being led by aristocrats and kind of making a virtue out of pragmatism. or I guess maybe even some sort of light Burkean conservative thought, is a very Oakeshottian conservatism, perhaps, in the sense of just trying to manage, perhaps, and avoid ideologies of any kind, and just try and make the best of things as they are. You say there's really two ways that Thatcher differs, and it's at the level of principle. One is rejects the consensus approach to politics in favor of a contest of ideas. She refers to herself as a conviction politician. Second key idea is the rejection of the idea of participation, which politics and policy will just be better if we get more people involved and citizens more engaged. That's something one hears in America all the time from progressives, from our liberals. That's the key. Of course, at the same time, they want to build up an administrative state and a regulatory state where actually participation is not what's going on. You're being told what to do by people who are largely unaccountable. But I want to think through those two ideas, because rejecting the consensus approach, in large measure, I would imagine in Britain at the time, there was a consensus around a large state and an intervening state. And those who were questioning it were kind of strange and on the outs, as it were. And I think she probably even sensed that. And so, in certain ways, and you talk about this, particularly when she's in various shadow governments, she's cagey in how she does this, precisely because she recognizes, temporarily, she's regarded as extreme.
Yes, that's right. That's quite right. The phrase that was bandied about, and I don't know whether you actually had it so much in America, but here it was the mixed economy. And the mixed economy was what everybody was meant to believe in. Now, the only thing that conservatives and socialists, under this particular scenario, were meant to differ about was precisely what mix it was. And indeed, there wasn't really a great deal of difference about that. Because the socialists would nationalize, and the Conservative Party might, try and denationalize a little bit, but normally by the time, as with steel or aerospace or something like that, by the time they'd actually got any legislation through, the Labour Party were back and renationalized it again. So we didn't. So basically, the fashionable view was, well, what we really need is a consensus, an agreement about what things the state should do, what things should be left to private individuals and businesses and so on. And this, of course, mirrored the international view, which was that in the end there would be some kind of coming together of capitalism in the West and socialism from the East. That there would be some kind of agreement, again, a kind of an agreement about what the functions of the state were and what the values in society should be and so on, and that there were no real final victories. Now, the trouble is, of course, that this has a certain attraction. It has even a certain attraction to a conservative with a small c, because as conservatives we don't believe that the only thing in life, and you and I probably are fascinated about politics, but conservatives don't believe that the only thing that matters in life is a constant political argument. Only the left really believe in this because they've got nothing better to do.
Among other things, yeah.
So it has some obvious attraction, but the trouble is that, first of all, the consensus, as far just actually taking it technically speaking, the consensus, the economic consensus based on the mixed economy didn't work. It certainly didn't work in Britain because we had extremely poor productivity. We were becoming poorer. So we couldn't just carry on. It wasn't good enough. And secondly, under the umbrella of consensus, what actually happened is, and this was Keith Joseph's great insight in the 70s. In fact, it wasn't so much consensus; it was the working of a socialist ratchet. That what actually happened was that under all this talk of consensus, that the left, when they came in, moved the ratchet further left as far as economics and personal liberty and lack of it is concerned, but the right never really did actually push it back. The right might accept consensus, but the left didn't. So, in fact, it was all a myth and a charade. And the final thing, of course, is that Mrs. Thatcher believed that there was a right and a wrong way of doing things. And she did think that individuals should control their own destinies rather than have those destinies controlled by the collective, the state. And if you believe that, you can't accept that a wrong consensus is any is any good at all. I mean, the argument for a consensus, and you mentioned actually Oakeshott.
Yes.
Now, Oakeshott, of course, was himself, although his best writings are often thought to justify pragmatism and so on, in practice, of course, he was really quite a right-wing conservative, you know.
Yes.
And so I think that his views were that he didn't want, he wanted to have consensus and continuity. Those were the two things he believed in society. He didn't think that actually that should be the case in politics, really. I mean, he was realistic enough to see that there was an ideological battle being fought. And if the Conservatives didn't fight it and just accepted some basis of consensus, anyway, what he believed or not is neither here nor there. She certainly believed that unless Conservatives fought, we would lose, and the only consensus there would be a consensus for socialism.
I want to, just coming out of this, ask you about a discrete episode which impressed upon me something that obviously had changed within Britain, and that is the battle over the grammar schools that she encounters as education secretary. And the notion, and you say, and I'm just trusting your observation, that there was just widespread consensus that the grammar schools should be largely done away with, and you call it comprehensive education should become the norm. I assume that's something like utilitarian public education, or what we would call.
It means that there's no selection on ability.
There's no So the grammar schools, which she had been selected into a grammar school, top 10% usually of British students by the age of 10 or 11 would enter these schools, and the grammar schools would be. Were important. This is also the first part of classical schooling, and so you're gaining in your knowledge there, and you're actually being prepared for perhaps admission to Oxford or Cambridge, I assume, something like that. So incredibly important for social elevation. Did you ever talk with her? And I'm wondering if she just had this moment when she's confronting this, and she's been criticized by a lot of people. Anthony Daniels, one British conservative, criticized her for not doing more to protect the grammar schools. In light of reading your book, I'm left to wonder what maybe there wasn't much she could do. But Go ahead.
There was nothing more she could have done.
And so did she have this moment when it was like, wow, this is not the Britain I grew up in Grantham, where something like this sort of egalitarian ethos may have been unthinkable, certainly wouldn't have been a consensus. And I'm just confronting a people who perhaps their mores and their habits and practices have just been changed by 2 decades now, roughly, of socialist democratic government. Just a question I had as I'm reading this episode.
Well, the thing is, I think what you say is that I don't believe that she ever had any of those kind of insights. She wasn't that sort of person.
Okay.
She was one of the cleverest people I've met, but she was certainly not an intellectual. She liked having intellectuals around because they stimulated her mental processes and also gave her some good phrases for speeches. And also because she was a conservative, I think conservatives do like to argue, proper conservatives. But so she wasn't. When I say she wasn't an intellectual, she wasn't somebody who would have gone away and sort of been quietly reflective and think, the world has changed. She just wasn't like that. So that's the first point. And actually, probably in some ways, it's quite a good thing that she didn't think like that. Yeah. I think probably, as a Catholic, I'm not allowed to blow my brains out, but I think at various points I would be more inclined to blow my brains out. But I'm sure she never went through any temptation like that. But on the grammar school thing itself, I think when one looks at it is the importance of grammar schools was, of course, that they are state schools. So it didn't matter how wealthy you were. You could send your children to them if your children passed the 11 plus, which was an open examination, and if you were bright enough, you got in. So it was quite ruthless. It wasn't always fair to everybody. It wasn't fair in the sense that, after all, we can all flunk out on a particular exam, but that's what exams are like. But it was basically fair, and it meant that people from modest backgrounds could actually get on. Now, there are two groups in British society, both of which have been very powerful over the years, who don't like that. First of all, there is what I'm going to get into trouble for saying is basically there's the lumpen proletariat. Basically, there are masses and masses of people, encouraged, of course, by the Labour Party, who feel that it's personal insult to them if somebody else actually fulfills their talents and gets on in life. And that has been a very big problem in Britain for many years, still is, probably will always be. But that's one side of it. The other side of it is right at the other side of the other end of the social spectrum, and that is all the people who've got money. Because inherited money, they didn't have to go to grammar schools. They went to private schools. They got on no matter how stupid they were. I mean, obviously it's better if you've got a brain or two, or a brain cell or two, you'll get even a bit further. But we still, of course, do have a lot of, I mean, the Conservative Party today is dominated by people who went to a very limited number of very exclusive private schools. And these two things come together. And they've done a lot of harm to Britain. And she actually represented the middle. She represented the people who believe that you've been given natural talents, you must use them, and who wanted to see other people being able to use those talents. I'm afraid that, I suppose, it's a sort of classical liberal view of things, which she had, but lots of conservatives and lots of old-fashioned Tories certainly didn't.
No, and as I'm thinking, you have talents and you should use them. And it's almost as if one could think of the idea of vocation or calling that I assume she would have breathed in and heard as she was growing up, and would have meant a lot to her. And I guess in a way, and you think about the lumpen proletariat, then also those of an elitist background, you can see how they would miss that or be disdainful of it in particular. So I thought it's an important mark. I mean, and I'm somewhat of I'm not a close observer of British society and politics, but as I read that episode, it just seemed so stark to me. And the way that the public reacted. I want to just think about this. We've alluded to this in the beginning. The significance of Margaret, I'd say the improbability, the significance of Margaret Thatcher becoming the leader of the Conservative Party, and all of the things that she learns in the 70s from the Heath government. And she also endures ridicule then. I mean, this is one episode of ridicule. And also, the episode of Thatcher, the milk snatcher, also comes in. And so she learns these sorts of things. And then she's challenging the Conservative Party. How improbable in Britain in the 1970s is it, if you're looking back, that someone like Thatcher rises to leadership?
I think that...
Or is it, or maybe the first question we should ask, in light of some of the things that you've written, a lot of people have talked about Britain in the 1970s, is that the stage, that what Britain was becoming in the 1970s, as was evident in just decline of living standards, the power of the unions, all these sorts of things working, did they, I guess, perhaps create that crisis for the uncommon person to rise?
Yes, I agree with that analysis. We had gone so far down the wrong route that we were either going to go even further down that route to a destiny that most people did not want, which was probably absolute economic decline and social disorder, or we had to draw back and we had to go in the other direction. In other words, we needed some radical change of direction if the terrible consequences of accumulated failure since 1945, to some extent since before then, were to be avoided. And democratic electorates don't generally like to change their minds profoundly about things, and the Conservative Party certainly doesn't like to change its mind very much about things, doesn't even like to think very much about things, but it certainly doesn't like to change its mind very much about things. But I believe that the same reasoning, the same background that produced Ronald Reagan also produced Margaret Thatcher. I mean, the Republicans certainly didn't want Reagan.
No.
And the Conservatives didn't want Thatcher. But in the end, I'm afraid you've actually got to choose people who believe in something and who have the competence and energy and drive and determination to make a difference. And that was why she became leader. I mean,
you're saying a Conservative Party that had, I mean, this is something that in my gloss, we have a Conservative Party under Edward Heath that had really run out of ideas.
Yes. Well, in fact, it had run out of it had tried some early on. It tried some of what you would think of as being Thatcherism, really. I mean, it came into power, for example, it said that under no circumstances would there be a prices and incomes policy. Well, In fact, within 2 years, we had wholesale bailouts of industry, we had massive intervention, we had nationalization, and we had the most systematic and detailed control of incomes and prices and so on that there's ever been in Britain, which of course again has parallels, of course, with you and mixed in the United States. But in fact, Conservatives, certainly on the economic front anyway, had not only run out of ideas, they'd actually decided they were going to borrow the left's ideas.
Yeah, you're right about that at some length. I'm thinking, so as the Heath government falls, she comes into power in 1979. What is her game plan? I mean, I guess we can all think about it in broad outline, but specifically the embrace of supply side economics and the willingness, I think, to be a monetarist is something that's significant as well. Is that and that also happens similarly in this country at the same time with Reagan and his
right.
Fed, so his Fed chairman, and so as I think about this, like a lot of parallels here, but it took tremendous courage. And it also had been launched, I think, as something that's developing in the 70s, is her association with the Institute for Economic Affairs and certain intellectuals there who she's sort of, I think, listening to and learning from in this regard.
Yes. Well, the right ideas have been around. Right in all senses, right ideas have been around for decades. For example, Keith Joseph, intellectual and political, or more intellectual monitor, had been close to the Institute of Economic Affairs in the 60s. And ever since the late 40s, the IEA had been exposing why government intervention in one sort or another was self-defeating. And the Conservatives in opposition were willing to take these things on board. But of course, as soon as they got the smell of power, they no longer listened to those sort of things. They did the opposite. So there was plenty of there were plenty of pamphlets had been published, plenty of speeches had been made, plenty of contributions had been delivered on all of these matters, but nobody had actually been listening. And you're quite right. I mean, the two key aspects were monetarism, which was it wasn't completely new in practice in Britain, because the International Monetary Fund in 1975-6 had imposed something like monetarism on the previous Labour government, and there had been control effectively of the money supply, domestic credit, and also big real cuts in public expenditure had been enforced on the Labour government. So it had been tried, but not actually practiced with any conviction. She actually brought the theory and the practice of monetarism and applied it to Britain. And then, of course, the supply side changes, and the most important supply side changes were simply abolishing the control of prices, incomes, exchange rate controls went after decades, went by the end of 1979, and industrial planning controls and all sorts of things, but particularly price controls. This was forecast as going to lead to the most terrible catastrophe and so on. Well, it didn't. I mean, prices did go up, but they went up and then gradually they came down because they depend basically on the amount of money that is flowing around in the economy. Our big problem and the unique problem, well, there were two unique problems in Britain. One was the size of the public sector, which you never have experienced in America. And our public sector, remember, was went far beyond what one would think of sort of basics, and also it was heavily monopolistic. And secondly, the power of the trade unions. And the trade unions were most powerful within the public sector. And so the combination of militant, left-wing, powerful trade unionism with state monopolies meant that when you tried to apply monetarism and supply-side economics, you came up against a brick wall. And this was the real problem. This brick wall had to be broken down, and that did not happen until, in fact, the miners' stroke in 1984-5.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you about that one in particular. I mean, she experiences a much stronger form, an intense pushback against her economic program, and she realizes, and I think what part of this is this unionized economy, or I guess what nationalized industries plus a lot of those guys are union, I guess.
Yeah, that's right.
And then you've got union guys in the private sector as well that aren't national. But so you've got all these things to deal with. I mean, you write about so even like the funeral workers went on strike at one point,
Yes.
and you couldn't bury your dead. Health workers go on
That's
strike. People with cancer weren't getting treatment. So that's, truly, public spectacle.
I just interrupt that. Of course, that strike, remember, occurred under the Labour Party.
Okay, I apologize.
No, it isn't a sort of silly point. What I'm saying is that the whole basis of, if you might call it, the consensus, really, the mixed economy consensus had already collapsed.
It did collapse, yeah.
It had already collapsed. And of course, if it had not so graphically collapsed in the winter of 78 to 9 before we came in, well, first of all, I'm not sure we would have won a majority anyway, but also we wouldn't have got the support of many ordinary trade unionists who looked back on what had happened when you say when the dead were unburied, laying unburied, and cancer patients couldn't be treated. This happened under socialism. So it's really quite important to remember that the whole socialist fiasco is no less of a fiasco even when the socialists are in power. We should keep on reminding the left of that, I think.
No, I think that's important. She did deal with the miners' strike, which you alluded to.
That's right.
And there really was. She saw this as something of a war. I think that's fair to say.
It was like a war. I was the main political advisor. Well, I was the only political advisor to the Home Secretary, who is responsible for the policing of Britain during that strike. And it was like a war, yes, because every day the pickets, who were being centrally organized by Scargill and the leadership of the National Union of Mine Workers, they would be planning just where they were going to where they were going to go, where they were likely to have most effect, where the police were likely to be weakest, where they could actually stop coal getting to the power stations, which is what they wanted to do. And it was a year of very like a war.
This is fascinating as well. The National Association of Mine Workers Union. Sorry, I don't have the title right there. It turns out, as you read about, they're actually receiving material support from the Soviet Union. They had moved their assets offshore. This truly was an association that did not have the interests of its own country.
No, that's right.
It's just really despicable.
Well, they had decided. One has to again recognize that the left in Britain was. I'm talking about the hard left. The hard left in Britain, throughout the Cold War years, they were basically out to destroy the country. Now, that might sound like Colonel Blimp, but Colonel Blimp on some occasions may have been right. They really were out to destroy the country. And the country in the sense of the existing system in the country. That seems a fair way of putting it. In other words, undermining capitalism and destroying parliamentary democracy as it was operating at the time, and ensuring that the rule of law did not apply. That seems to me to be just about destroying the country. And in this struggle, they certainly saw the Soviet Union and various other pro-Soviet powers, like Libya, for example, as being their allies rather than their enemies. And so this was a hard ideological battle which was being fought, and it could only be won actually if you were equally hard and ideological in dealing with it. What had happened is that the 1983 general election was a catastrophic loss for the Labour Party. They did terribly badly. And so once that had happened in the summer of 1983, the trade unions, who'd been fairly quiet in the previous year or two, they were basically given their head, and at the head of the head, as it were, the key militant force was the National Union of Mine Workers, that no restraint was going to be applied to them by the rest of the left. They were going to be allowed to try to bring down the government. And remember, they had brought down effectively the Heath government in 1974. they thought they could do it again. And they nearly did.
Yeah.
But nearly is not enough.
No, crucial. I thinking, and I know this has been discussed endlessly, is looking back over her time and thinking about what she actually achieved, what she didn't achieve. I suppose the measure of that is what actually stuck once she left. And in a parliamentary system,
Yeah.
Obviously power flows differently than a separation of power system. But I suppose she did shrink public spending as a percentage of GDP.
Yeah.
I'm not sure if she did in absolute terms. And then I guess your public sector is still...
not in absolute terms, but, I think it's legitimate to say that, that actually what really matters is a share of the nation's wealth.
And economic growth grew dramatically. And then I suppose the public sector remained largely unchanged. I mean, we had privatized industries, but a number of industries, but in terms of, we still have a very, I would say, active...
60% of state-owned businesses were privatized.
Yeah.
60%. And public expenditure as a share of GDP fell well below 40%. And for the last 2 or 3 years, 3 years, we were actually repaying debt. So, that is a very substantial turnaround.
Looking back, do conservatives in Britain today look back at Thatcher as a benchmark, as a model? Conservatives in America do this all the time with Ronald Reagan. In fact, I think it's actually somewhat dysfunctional, given new challenges, new opportunities that need to be seized. Does this happen in Britain? And then also just thinking about Tony Blair and Gordon Brown, how did they adjust and moderate to changes that Thatcher had made? Gordon Brown spent a lot of money. And also, I remember Britain under the trailing part of his time being placed under watch, I think, by an international body for the public spending that it was doing. So, I guess I'm just trying to think through, what actually was achieved here.
Well, I think the long term changes that were most important were the reform of trade unions, and the reduction in trade union power. And this was crucial because we wouldn't have got foreign investment going, and we wouldn't have got the big increase in productivity. Now, the productivity in Britain is too low, and in fact, it's actually, and this is quite worrying, been declining despite the recent recession. But historically speaking, under Thatcher, we rose from what had been 12th in the international productivity lead to 5th. There was a big increase in productivity. That would not have happened without the reduction in trade union power. Then, of course, reduction in marginal rates, not the overall burden of taxation, but marginal tax rates, deregulation, privatization, opening up the scope for new businesses, 1.5 million new jobs created, 75% increase in self-employment and so on. These things, this change of direction, this shift, which was partly psychological, but also practical too in the economy, that's not been reversed. And Gordon Brown had an attempt at the end, under the shadow of the banking crisis, to do some of this, and started to say, that Thatcherism or the capitalism had failed. Well, the general electorate decided in 2010 they didn't agree with him, and so we might not have an ideal government. But the present government does broadly accept it. It might not like the Thatcher tone, but it broadly accepts the Thatcher economic analysis. When
you look at David Cameron and his government now, do you see a party returning to aristocratic roots and that sort of thinking, or is it still a party you think led by kind of a middle-class ethos that Thatcher had, and which seemed to really jive well with classical liberal thought, or is there something else emerging that's more of a management style philosophy? Well, I think it is. There was a reaction against Thatcherism in all respects in certain areas of the Conservative Party, the so-called modernizers. I think there are some modernizers in the Republican Party, and they may do almost as much damage as
as the modernisers and the Conservative Party have done. I don't know. Let's hope not. But anyway, our modernisers, they wanted to be modern because they thought that Tony Blair was the real model rather than Mrs. Thatcher. And Cameron and his aristocratic friends, or certainly very well-heeled friends, are very much of that way of thinking. And they tried this. It almost lost Cameron the leadership when he was in opposition, because, of course, what happened was that the sort of the modernising, softer kind of Conservative didn't really want to talk about economics at all. They wanted to talk about, for example, climate change. But then we had this banking and economic crisis in 2009, and suddenly the Conservative Party found it didn't actually have an economic policy. So it dreamt one up fairly quickly, and basically what they have been doing is a sort of Thatcherism, because there isn't really any other way out. I mean, if you're spending too much money, you're borrowing too much money, then you've got to stop. And what they have not managed to do is to reduce taxation. And she found it quite difficult to reduce taxation, but I don't think that, unfortunately, the present Conservative leadership quite understands the demoralising effect of high marginal tax rates. And they're far more interested in appearing to be caring and compassionate and just, all of which is very nice to be. But the most important thing is to get the economy. Well, the economy is moving again, but getting the economy to move in a sustainable way, year after year, because it's more efficient. Anyway, I don't want to downplay. Well, they have had some successes, but they turned away from Thatcher, and now, with some reluctance, I think they've turned back to her.
So maybe a fair way for us to end our discussion is post Thatcher, not in the sense of in the sense of I don't understand myself as a Thatcher acolyte or disciple, but largely influenced and in the shadow of her policies and ideas, even
Yes.
Even in spite of themselves.
Yes, I think that's a fair way of putting it.
Yeah.
Personally, I'm a whole hog Thatcherite.
Yeah, well, that was obvious to me in reading your book. Robin, thank you so much for discussing
Not at all.
the book.
It was very enjoyable.
Thank you so much for this. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
This is your host, Richard Greinch, and you have been listening to a podcast that can be found at libertylawsite.org, where you can subscribe, comment, and find other episodes and links related to today's conversation. Our email address is lal@libertyfund.org.